Well, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to the shop. My name is Nathaniel, and in this video I'm going to be taking you guys through my process of refinishing this solid mahogany tabletop. Now, the steps I'm going to take are going to be one, to strip the existing finish, and from there I can fill any cracks, which I do have some, and sand. Now, after the sanding process, I'm going to be applying the new finish, which is going to be Rubio Monocoat. So stick around, there's a lot to do. Let's get to it. So this is our starting point. This table has seen some heavy use over the years, a lot of water stains and discoloring. Here's a big crack here. I think it's actually at a glue joint that is separated. So this big table measures in at 5 feet wide by 9 feet long. Wow. An interesting feature of this table is this spline that actually wraps around the entire perimeter. So let's get into it. I decided not to use any chemical paint thinner or finishing removal product on this. I wanted to just use card scrapers. And it was a bit of work, but it really didn't take very long. And if I can avoid using harsh chemicals in the shop, I'm going to. So partway through this process, I needed to re-burnish my card scrapers. So I used the flat edge of a file to retrue the edge of the card scraper and use a burnishing tool to sort of smash down an edge that allows me to raise a burr or a hook. And a properly burnished card scraper should yield some nice shavings and not dust. So let's see how I did. That is what we're looking for. I can also use the card scraper to scrape the finish off of this edge profile. Fun fact about this table, it was actually made 30 years ago by a good friend of mine. And in case you're wondering, that's 1 year older than I am. It's a good idea to leave a patch of the old finish somewhere on the table. That way we can reference it when picking out colors for new stains. So here I'm just going to sand the end grain on this edge profile rather than using the card scraper, which would likely damage it. And isn't this square sander made for this job? Starting with 80 grit, the sanding process begins. So I'm moving pretty quick here. This is a powerful sander and it removes material in a hurry, so I don't want to be caught hovering in one place. After 80 grit, I move to 100, then 120, and finally 150. And I'll explain why I stop at 150 later in the video. Patience is key here. It does take a long time to work your way up through the sanding grits, but it really affects the final outcome of the project, so it's well worth it. Alright, so let's take a look at our 3 samples. I chose chocolate, black, and walnut. Now these are the little Rubio Monocoat samples. So let's look at the chocolate. It's a pretty dark, murky color. I don't think it highlights the grain very well, and I don't think it's a good color match to the existing finish, which is what we're trying to do. It may match up with some of the really dark spots, but overall, I don't think that chocolate's the right choice. Moving on to black, this is even darker. It's a little more clearer, but it still is not going to match up well with the lighter areas in this wood. Moving on to walnut, I think this is my obvious choice. It is a really good color match to the existing finish. So we're going to go with walnut, strip this oil off, and get it sanded to match up with the sanding I've already done, and then it's time for finish. Before I can get to final sanding, I'll need to fill some of the cracks and voids in this top. For the smaller crack, I'm going to use a water-based wood filler. It's easy to apply and dries relatively quick. Now these cracks and gaps are indicators that this tabletop may have been restricted from expanding and contracting with the seasons. This spline running across the grain might have had something to do with it, or maybe the way it was attached to the base. But that's a topic for another video. For this large split here, I'm going to be using epoxy to fill it. I apply blue tape as close as I can to the edges of the split, and that way I'm not leaving myself with more work down the road when I get messy with the epoxy. So I did some sanding without the vacuum on. Instead, I put this little dust boot on here, and that allowed me to capture some of the dust from this tabletop and use it to color the epoxy. And you want to be careful when mixing sawdust into epoxy because it really thickens up the mixture. Too thick, and the epoxy won't seep into those little cracks like we want it to. But what I like about this method is that this crack will hopefully, when filled, not be very noticeable. Using a syringe helps deliver the epoxy directly into the crack. This is a relatively big crack, and it takes a lot of epoxy. But once the crack is fully filled, I use a torch to pop the air bubbles that come to the surface. And the torch heats up the epoxy, so it tends to soak in a little bit more. So I can add a little where necessary and let it dry for 24 hours. With the epoxy fully cured, I can get that tape off of there, and then I'll sand it down flush with the rest of the tabletop, and hopefully it'll look like that crack was never there. And card scrapers are also effective on epoxy. But do be careful when you're using the card scraper, because I got a boo-boo. And with all the crack and void filling behind us, I'll turn my attention back to sanding. Apparently I was really getting into that song. Okay, that's enough. Water popping. So I mentioned earlier that I was only sanding up to 150, and it sounds a little low when we're talking about furniture. We think of 180, 220, or even higher. But in this case, Rubio is an oil wax finish, and it needs a more porous or open grain to attach itself to the wood fibers. And the water helps raise the grain. But it does leave a rough surface, so I quickly sand again with 150 and vacuum off the dust. Bringing us to the final step before finish, and that's using mineral spirits to clean off the remaining dust. Rubio is a 3-to-1 mixture with the hard wax oil and the accelerator. Application is relatively straightforward. I use a spreader to get the oil onto the surface, and then a white abrasive pad on an orbital sander to drive that oil into the wood. Now this process was a little bit stressful because of how big this tabletop is and how little working time you really have with this stuff. The excess oil needs to be removed fairly quickly, or else it becomes really tacky and difficult to remove. So here I'm using this buffer to remove the oil, and it worked pretty well, But I gotta say, there's nothing quite like a little elbow grease, or a lot of elbow grease in my case. When I'm using Rubio on smaller projects, I don't even bother with the buffer. Doing this by hand, I can really feel the spots that are smooth and the spots that are sticky. So that's almost a wrap. I wait 24 hours and apply this maintenance oil by Rubio, and it gives it a really nice sheen and a little bit more protection. And I'm just thrilled with the result. Here's a close look at that crack we filled with epoxy. Blends right in. Well, thank you guys so much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed seeing my process of refinishing, and I hope you're able to take something away from it. Refinishing can be an arduous task, from stripping the old finish to sanding and then applying the new finish. It's a long process, but it's a very rewarding one when you get to see the wood restored to its former beauty and the way it should be. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. Until next time, guys, take care.